The following podcast has been produced by the Museum of History and Industry in partnership with Jack Straw Productions.
Today I have the great pleasure to speak with Jane Sanders, the author of Cold War on the Campus. Dr. Sanders, let's talk about Albert Canwell and the Joint House-Senate Legislative Subcommittee to investigate anti-American activities in the state of Washington. What was this about?
The 1947 Washington State Legislature acted to form the Canwell Committee in the wake of 40 years of suspicion of subversives in our country in replication of the federal government. The U.S. Attorney General formed a list of organizations that were deemed to be subversive. Among those was the Communist Party, the Nazi Party, the Socialist Party. If that organization was on the Attorney General's list, even though it had operated 20 years before, you could be suspected of subversive activities. And the federal government then required all of its workers, employees, to sign a disclaimer saying they weren't a member of a subversive group. The Washington State Legislature in 1947 acted the same way. They required employees to sign a loyalty oath, and they instituted the Subversive Activities Committee to investigate state government to see if any employees were in fact subversive. Albert Canwell was named the committee chairman because he had some investigative experience as a deputy in the Spokane County Sheriff's Office. One of the chief targets was the University of Washington, which had been rumored for many years to harbor communists on its faculty.
What did a Canwell hearing look like?
It was a kind of extra legal type hearing. It was more like a grand jury. The committee would ask questions and people were required to answer. They could have attorneys at their side, but their attorneys were not allowed to speak.
Were civil liberties being undermined by the Canwell hearings?
Yes, in the sense that people weren't allowed the protection of the First Amendment, of the Fifth Amendment. People who pleaded, protection under the First Amendment, free speech, were considered suspicious by that very notion. People's civil liberties were undermined. They were deprived of jobs without due process, without ever even knowing who their accusers were. So, yes.
I think a thing that has always shocked me in this sort of hysterical atmosphere that began to develop around the hearings was that people were essentially tried in the newspaper, where there would be headlines in the morning paper and the evening paper that recounted the 5-word synopsis of testimony saying that such and such had been accused and so had been accused.
Right. And one led to another, and before you knew it, your neighbor was involved.
Can you talk about one particular case at the University of Washington?
Well, there's the famous case of Professor Mel Rader. The Canwell Committee at that time presented what they said was solid proof that Mel Rader was a communist, and Rader went through tremendous efforts to prove that what they had said about him was wrong. And the Seattle Times won a Pulitzer Prize as a result of Ed Guthman's investigations.
Was the fear of subversion by people next door or the teacher in the school, was that an exaggerated fear?
Generally speaking, yes. Since there were very few incidents of actual findings of communists, the long-term effects of the Canwell Committee were this wave of loyalty security efforts that didn't end with state government but rolled right down to these sort of chilling episodes of people being fired or not hired. Investigations were rampant, setting neighbor against neighbor, and friend against friend.